thinkers. The people like Reverend Manshi Kiyozawa, who kind of started that whole movement of reinterpreting Jodo Shinshu for the world that we live in. And there were others who followed, Reverend Ryojin Soga, Reverend Haya Akegarasu, Reverend Daiei Kaneko, Reverend Rijin Yasuda, and others. And Reverend Nakai has done an extensive study on all of these thinkers, and I can't think of anyone else who can give these lectures to us. And so I think that we're very fortunate that Reverend Nakai will present 10 lectures on the modern thinkers of our Higashimanji tradition. And I also want to thank all of you for joining us for this first lecture this afternoon. Well, without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Reverend Nakai, and we'll receive the first lecture from her today. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Bishop Ito. In addition to thanking Bishop Noriaki Ito of North America, I also give my thanks to Bishop Kenjun Kawata of Hawaii District for his support, and also Shinshu Center of America's Reverend Ryoko Osa and Reverend Tomoyuki Hasegawa, who have helped me a lot on this project. And thanks, of course, to all of you for attending today. Please join me in Gassho. Namamida tsu. Namamida. Namamida. Okay. First of all, I want to say I'm not going to be reading the chat during my lecture. You can use chat to chat with each other, or if you think of a question and you want to write it down so you don't forget it, that's okay to use the chat for that purpose. But I will, after I finish speaking, I'll, there'll be some time to ask questions, but I prefer people would ask the questions live. And you can use the raise hand function to do that. And I'm going to be going over in my PowerPoint, our focus. But another thing that's come up in some of my study classes, I know some of you are bilingual and you have some questions about the Japanese text, which I may or may not be able to answer. Please save those kind of questions for after the closing gassho so that the monolingual people can leave us and we can have a little chat about some of the Japanese terms. Reverend Osa, if you can let me share my screen.
You can.
Oh, it's on? Okay,
yeah.
right. Okay, let me see if this works. Slideshow. Okay, I see everybody. All right. So I made a PDF of my PowerPoint and I've sent it to Reverend Osa. Hopefully she can send it to everyone, especially some of the people who registered and couldn't make it today. So this is just kind of an overview time today. First of all, I wanted to go over that. We call it modern Shin Buddhism, but the word modern has a little different meaning in Japanese than in English. It is not meaning contemporary like right now, but it's referring to Kindai Kyogaku. Kyogaku means the study of the teachings, but Kindai in Japanese is a very specific time period. Well, not strictly defined, but generally the middle of the 19th century to the middle of the 20th century. So it's before most of us were born or became adults. So in Japanese, Kindai means the near age, not the current age, but the age close to us. So for the purpose of this course, that's the meaning of modern, talking about that period in Japanese history called Kindai. So here's a timeline, but I really suggest to everyone, if you haven't seen Reverend Ken Yamada's lecture for the BCA's Center for Buddhist Education, it was on the history of Higashi and Nishihon Ganji. He does a really good job of going over this history. So I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail here, but I just want to give you kind of a perspective of the time. So as we all know, Shinran, excuse me, Shinran is like the 12th and 13th centuries. About 100 years after Shinran was the Iko Iki. It's a series of what they would call peasant rebellions that just kind of sporadically came up here and there, which lasted like 200 years. I'm surprised it was such a large period. As some of you might be familiar with Martin Luther, that when he published his Protestant presentation of Christianity as opposed to the Catholic one, it gave people a sense of equality, that even the lowest classes had the same spiritually had the same worth as people high above them. And so in Martin Luther's time, there are actually peasant rebellions during his lifetime. Unfortunately, he not only condemned the violence, he badmouthed the peasants. I feel like Shinran, if he knew about the peasant rebellions, he probably would feel sad that there was violence, but I don't think he would have talked bad about those people rebellion. And he maybe, in some sense, he understands the reasons for their rebellion. When you have a teaching like Jodo Shinshu, or even the Pure Land teachings themselves, where people, or all beings are equal, all beings are considered equally worthy. And so it's not much relief for people to start thinking, well, if I'm equal to the other people, why are some people making me do all the work and they're getting all the money? What gives them that right to tell me what to do all this hard work for them? So I think that kind of thinking, because of the teachings of Jodo Shinshu, entered into the minds of the peasants. Of course, Iko Iki has some political details to it that I'm not going to get into, but it wasn't purely a religious rebellion. There were a lot of different political factions going on at the time, but it is a reflection of people seeing that this message of equality, of liberation for yourself and all beings, does have a reflection on how you see your current life and your society. Renyo, he came into the middle of Iko Iki going on, so he kind of had to walk this tightrope of trying to spread the teachings, but keeping the so-called subversive elements kind of low-keyed, so as not to upset some of the political powers going on. But he had to deal with all these warring factions and trying to keep the Honganji people from getting out of hand in the eyes of these political people. And as you know, the party that won out after all these decades of war was the Tokugawa shogun. His family unified Japan. And at the same time that he unified Japan, that's when the Honganji split between Nishi and Higashi. And it's kind of his doing. He figured that divide and conquer. He knew that the Honganji was a powerful group that did have its own, people willing to go to war or do whatever they felt the Honganji was in the best interest of Honganji. So he sort of played the Nishi Higashi, the two brothers played them off each other so that they created the separation of Honganji. But the Tokugawa era, also known as Edo Jijai, Edo meaning the old name for Tokyo, it lasted quite a while. And I think a lot of you are familiar. During that time of unification of Japan, it was also a time of uniformity, that the shogunate felt very strongly that Japan should be closed off to the rest of the world. They were well aware what happened to the other countries in Asia once you let the Westerners get in there. They say first the missionaries and the soldiers. So they wanted to keep Japan closed off from the world. So you wouldn't have that kind of element coming into the country. And also they kept close tabs on the people through the temples, and really regulated everything that they could about the way people lived. But then Japan was forced to open up when Admiral Perry came with his black ships, 1853. There was also already a lot of political unrest going on within Japan even before Admiral Perry, but that incident was the catalyst for what we call the Meiji Restoration. Meiji was the name of the emperor, and the emperor was restored as the head of Japan rather than the shogun. So that's why it's called restoration, because now it's ruled by the emperor instead of the shogunate. And Kiyozawa was born right before that happened. And during the shogunate, the favored class was the samurai. They were the ones who were considered the protectors of the shogunate. And Kiyozawa's father was a low-level samurai, but being a samurai meant guaranteed income because of his duty as a soldier for the shogunate. But once the Meiji Restoration happened, Kiyozawa's father, along with all these other samurais, were suddenly out of a job. And the family went from so-called comfortable middle class to being very poor. And the father had to scrimp and save whatever he could do. They said like he sold tea from door to door. He just grabbed whatever gigs he could to support the family. So Kiyozawa lived through this great upheaval that happened with the Meiji Restoration. And in fact, it was a very unstable time. A lot of things, a lot of upheavals throughout Japanese society at that time. But also, I feel like Kiyozawa came into adulthood during a very special window in Japanese history, that the Meiji Restoration freed people from a lot of that regulation that the shogunate imposed on everybody. And it was before the imperial government started really cracking down on the population. So there's this time during the late 19th century, maybe early 20th century, where the Japanese society, there was a lot of freedom for this brief period, not complete freedom, but for thinkers, it was kind of a time that they could experiment and try different expressions. So that was a very precious window that Kiyozawa came into adulthood. Then his two main disciples, students, Ryojin Soga and Daiei Kaneko, you see their timelines there. And then Yasuda is also considered part of this Kindai Kyogaku. There's many other teachers, including some Nishihonganji people, who are considered part of the Kindai Kyogaku trend. And I'm not going to go into all of them. I just wanted to hit on these four major figures in the Higashi Honganji, and then also into Haya Akegarasu and Shuichi Maeda because of their influence here in the States. And so the focus for me is not so much seeing this through Japanese eyes, but seeing it through Japanese American eyes. And one of the things I wanted to make a point about what we call this Kindai Kyogaku, this modern Shin Buddhism, is not my grandma's Shin Buddhism. And you can see from the timeline that the activities of Kiyozawa and his students happened pretty much after the Japanese immigration started to the West. As you know, in Hawaii, they started coming at the end of the 19th century, and then the beginning of the 20th century was a lot of the immigration to the mainland. And so the Shin Buddhism that came over to my grandparents' generation, the first, what they call Issei, the first generation Japanese American, was the old Jodo Shinshu. And so just for the purpose of this class, I'm going to be referred to as a Tokugawa Jodo Shinshu. Even though a lot of elements are feudal, they come before Tokugawa. But what makes it different from Shinran's time and shortly after is because of this crackdown on society, partly as a response to Iko Iki, that it's a certain presentation that of Jodo Shinshu that people like Kiyozawa felt was not appropriate for his time. But the thing is, that's the Jodo Shinshu that came to America, that came to Hawaii and the West Coast, was that Tokugawa era Jodo Shinshu. And I think one of the main differences is this. I know the Galen Amstead did a presentation a couple of weeks ago, and he called it presentism. I guess some of us would call it existentialism. That Kiyozawa wanted to bring back the Jodo Shinshu teachings to what Shinran often emphasizes, the here and now, my life here and now, your life here and now. That this, he talks about the present benefits, that Jodo Shinshu is something that helps us in our life now. But then with Renyo and trying to appease the higher ups, the message got shifted. And I think in Tokugawa era, it's almost like all the Buddhists were told, don't talk about today, talk about the afterlife, talk about tell the peasants not worry about what's going on right now, because they'll be rewarded in their next life in a nice paradise or something. So there was a shift, especially in the Tokugawa period, to ask the Buddhists, or tell the Buddhist temples not to talk about anything subversive that would be considered subversive, to maintain the hierarchy of society, to make people satisfied with their lot in life, even though it's might be painful, and with promises of a better life after death. So that Tokugawa era Jodo Shinshu is different from Shinran's teachings and the early Jodo Shinshu, and Kiyozawa wanted to bring that back. So that's the contrast I'm making between what I call the Tokugawa Jodo Shinshu and this modern Shin Buddhism. Okay, so this is the themes of this class. I want to keep this in mind. I may show this in every class. We're not going to look at these people as scholars. I mean, sometimes they call it thinkers, that's fine. But to think of them primarily as Budosha. And I'm sorry about the people raising their hand, but I'll take questions afterwards if you don't mind. It can also be pronounced Kyudosha, but it means people seeking the way, seeking what is the truth, what is the true way to live our lives. So think of all these people primarily as seekers. They themselves would see themselves as seekers, just like Shinran, even up until his very old age, was continually trying to learn, to seek, to consult the teachings, to listen to the words of his teachers and his teachers, to help him in this seeking to live his life in the most truthful way. So even though they may have taught in schools, we're not going to talk about them as scholars as much. The second point, I think we got a nice diverse group here, in that all of us are, we want to deepen our understanding of Shinshu, but my question to all of you is, by hearing about this modern approach, can it be helpful in reaching those who have not yet encountered Shinshu, or who have only encountered unsatisfactory presentations? So in my case, hearing about my grandmother's Jodo Shinshu just was unsatisfactory to me. It just didn't mean a whole lot to keep hearing say the Nembutsu and go to the Pure Land. And so for me personally, this encounter with the modern teachings really brought Shinran's teachings to my heart. I'm grateful for the Buddhist Temple of Chicago that we have that lineage that follows from Kiyozawa on. But for those of you, a lot of you, especially, well, the people in the Higashi, you've already been exposed to much of this through your ministers. And then also people from Orange County have been exposed to this through Reverend Marvin Harada, the current Bisei bishop. So a lot of you listening in have already been exposed to these teachings, but some of you maybe have not. And so the question for you is this helpful in bringing Shinshu to new audiences, or is this helpful, or is this kind of unnecessary layer is kind of my question. But I really feel that so much of what's going on with Shinshu is still in the Tokugawa period. I recently heard a newly minted BCA minister give a Dharma talk, and my comment was that she said in English what my grandparents probably heard in Japanese, which was, say the Nembutsu and go to the Pure Land. It didn't much go beyond that kind of presentation. So I think there's still a lot of people probably still in Higashi too, but there are people who have been going to Jodo Shinshu temples, and they haven't yet encountered this modern approach. So whether it's helpful or not is a question I have for you, and whether it helped new audiences understand Shinshu is also something for us all to consider. And then lastly, this is one of the most important points, is that the focus on community. We don't do this in a vacuum by ourselves. Our spiritual journey happens in community with others. We're not, as Dr. Tanaka would say, we're not nightstand Buddhists. We're people in community, and these people we're going to be looking at also functioned in community. Their teachings were meant to be taken in community, and they themselves saw themselves as part of community. So I kind of like to use the word nurture, because that gives you the sense of mothers and grandmas and aunties all helping you on your journey, rather than the word self-cultivation. So that's a focus I want to strongly emphasize in this course. And so if you have questions or comments outside the themes of this class, I may have to call you out on that, and try to go back to the focus that I think these are the important points that we should focus on. So this brings me to the 1893 Parliament of World Religions. So if you go to the Shinshu Center of America website and look at their publications, they all refer back to this event. This happened in Chicago, and it was a gathering of all these different religious leaders and teachers from all over the world. And it was part of the Columbian Exposition. If you know what that is, Columbus supposedly discovered the New World in 1492. So in 1892, they had a Columbian Exposition in Chicago, where it was like a World's Fair, what we call World's Fair. And so one of our members, their library was throwing out a bunch of old books. And I guess they were nice to let the public come in and grab those books if they wanted them before they were sent to the trash bin. And one of our members found this book. It was the abstract from all the goings on at the Parliament of World Religions. And I was so happy to find the page where Kiyozawa's work is introduced there. And it's introduced by Zenshiro Noguchi, who is the official translator for the Japanese delegation. So he says here, it's really hard to explain what the Mahayana teachings are, but I have found this book by Professor Tokunaga. And Tokunaga is what I call Kiyozawa's maiden's name. He became a Kiyozawa when he got married into a temple family, but his actual birth last name was Tokunaga. So the translator says, I have found this work, which I translated because I feel it does, for what I feel, talks about what Mahayana Buddhism is for the Westerners, for the English-speaking world. So this is actually in that transcript of what went on at the Parliament of World Religions. But of course, you see what he says. I only have 10 copies left, he said. I've been giving it away to people all along my journey. So let me just pass out the last 10 copies I have near me. So you can imagine with 10 copies, it didn't make that big of a splash at that Parliament. What did make a splash at the Parliament, as many of you know, was a man named Shaku Soen, a Zen monk. And he impressed one particular person named Paul Karras. And Paul Karras married into the Hagler family, which was a rich industrial family. And with some of that money, he started his own publishing company, Open Court. And he wanted to publish things about culture and philosophy. And he liked Shaku Soen's Zen presentation so much, he asked the monk to come back to the Illinois and help him translate Buddhist texts. But Shaku Soen said, I got other things to do. Let me send my young guy, one of my followers, to you. And that person's name was D.T. Suzuki. And so D.T. Suzuki lived with the Karras family out in LaSalle, Illinois, which is about a couple hours drive west of Chicago. And from that experience of living with the Karras family and being a translator, it was the D.T. Suzuki that we know that introduced Buddhism to the West. So that's really what happened Buddhist-wise from the Parliament of World Religions. Actually, there was a boatload of Japanese priests at this event. And many of them were Nishi Honganji priests, but apparently only Shaku Soen made a lasting impression on the attendees. So going to that booklet that was passed out by Zenshiro Noguchi, this comes at the very end of that booklet. And the booklet is called The Skeleton of a Philosophy of Religion. And so Kiyozawa is writing this and helping Noguchi translate it as a way of explaining Buddhism, particularly Jodo Shinshu, to the West. So in many ways, Kiyozawa represents one of the first generations of Japanese to be educated in Western culture and philosophy at Tokyo University. So in some ways, I feel he's not that different from us, that we also have been educated in a Western, what they call Western philosophy through our education, from grade school on. And sometimes it's so much a part of us that we really aren't conscious of how much we've adopted in our thinking that kind of Western philosophy stance. So that's one of the reasons I feel Kiyozawa speaks to us, because he's coming from that, he understands that stance of Western philosophy and how to present Buddhism for people coming from that Western philosophy. And so in this pamphlet, he does make several references to Christianity or the monotheistic, Judeo-Christian tradition, and of course, the great philosophers. So here at the very ending of his pamphlet, he says, the fact is that the self-exertion gate. So here, this is a good example. He doesn't use a traditional Buddhist terminology. He wants to use terminology that makes sense to Westerners. So instead of saying Shodomon, the gate of the path of sages, he says the self-exertion gate. And instead of saying the Pure Land gate, he says the other power gate. And instead of saying Amida, he's going back to the meaning of Amida in Sanskrit, that the Chinese teachers, Pure Land teachers, all knew Amida was a transliteration, putting syllables on a foreign word, which meant mita meaning measure, meaning not, so not measurable. So from the very early stages of the Pure Land teachings, we knew that they knew that Amida is this not measurable. It's a name that refers to what is beyond our comprehension and includes all of the universe. So in that case, Kiyozawa felt that a word that would work in Japanese would be mugen, meaning no limits, but in English it translates into infinite. And then the opposite, yugen, having limits, translates in English as finite. Though one of the problems I feel is because all of us took math class, so our idea of a finite and infinite might be a little different than what Kiyozawa is referring to. But think of what he's saying is infinite is the meaning of Amida. When he refers to infinite, he's saying Amida. And when he's saying finite, he's meaning the limited beings, meaning us. So That's the terminology he uses. But he does use other power that were from our tradition. So I'm going to read the first paragraph here. The fact is that in the self-exertion gate, the distinction of the finite and the infinite is swept away at the moment of the appearance of peace of mind. And there is one not finite nor infinite, but the absolute, so to say, individual. And the absolute individual develops quickly or slowly to the mysterious moment of self-perfection. Hence, there is no distinction of religion and morality here. The sole thing is a series of self-exertion till the enlightenment. And what he says in this paragraph is the way I thought Buddhism was, and the way many Westerners think Buddhism is about, that it's about, as an individual, you have this experience of joining with the infinite, and you keep working in that phase to get to this sense of total self-perfection. So morality doesn't enter here because it's just you and the infinite. But then Kiyozawa goes on to describe the Jodo teachings. But in the gate of the other power, a different phenomenon takes place. Here, the distinction of the finite and the infinite gets its clear vividness at the moment of the appearance of peace of mind or belief. The individual is vividly finite, and the other power is vividly infinite. The finite vividly move, live, and have their being in the bosom of the infinite. The double relation of the finite is distinctly discovered. On one part, there is the religious relation toward the infinite. On the other, the moral relation toward the other finites. Religiously, he is ever thankful for the infinite grace of the other power who has completed all exertion in behalf of the unenlightened and requires nothing from the succored but the remembrance of his all-embracing benevolence and intelligence. Morally, the believers of the other power gate are humbly yet stoutly observant of all the duties incumbent on the finite as finite, exerting his utmost energy for the progress and improvement of the world. And of course, Noguchi's English is not perfect. I did write a whole master's thesis on this piece, so I can talk on and on about it, but I hope you get the idea. Kiyozawa is saying there's that first paragraph, that's that idea of Buddhism that is very prevalent, but there's this other path that is about the distinction being vivid. Instead of this blending of the finite and infinite, there's this distinction that becomes very clear. And it forces us to have this sense of humility toward the infinite, but it also makes us aware of our fellow limited beings, and that we want to, in our, like he says, how we move, live within the infinite, how we interact with those fellow limited beings. So in many ways, this paragraph, Kiyozawa is paraphrasing Shinran. He's trying to get across what Shinran is saying, but he's doing it in a very, what you call, modern way for this Western audience that receiving this pamphlet. So this is something I want you all to think about, because a lot of us, like I said myself, I thought Buddhism was this first paragraph, but now I've come to really appreciate the Jodo Shinshu teachings as in this second paragraph. I would say that there are many people in traditions such as Zen, Theravada, the various Vajrayana schools that have testified to the fact that this first paragraph process has been achieved by people. There are testimonies of people who have achieved that moment of enlightenment, that sense of self-perfection, and total identification with the whole universe. So there are people who will testify to that. There are records of people testifying that. So I could say it works. It does work for some people. Apparently, it is a way for some people. But for the rest of us who don't have the time and energy to exert ourselves in that direction, there's this other path that Kiyozawa is trying to get across, and this is the Jodo Shinshu tradition. And he does make that point at the end that it's not about being an individual seeking perfection, but it's about us as one of many individuals having a relation to the infinite, and also at the same time having a relation to our other limited beings. So I could see why that this pamphlet didn't make much of a splash at the Parliament of World Religions, because it's just not the way we think in America, and maybe even now. And in a way, it's kind of like upaya, like skillful means that Shaku Soen made the impression. D.T. Suzuki came over here, and maybe for Westerners, they needed to first learn Buddhism from someone like D.T. Suzuki before they could really understand what Kiyozawa is putting forth in this piece. So this is just something I just leave you with to think about, because so much of our talk at the temple, sometimes we sound too much like the first paragraph, and we don't talk in the terms of the second paragraph too much. I've seen presentations that when we do gasho, one hand is Amida and one hand is me and Amida get to be one. That's not what Shinran and Kiyozawa are talking about. They're talking about a whole different kind of relation than what we want to think religion is, or what we want to think enlightenment is. So so I'm gonna get out of my screen sharing. Oh no, one more slide. This is a schedule. Oops. Okay, this is, oops, I went out. Okay, this is a schedule which we will meet on the last Thursday of every month, except next month is Thanksgiving. So we're gonna meet at the beginning of December, and then at the end of December. And then from there is the last Thursday of every month. These Japanese titles are just kind of general topics. I'm trying to think of what to frame each presentation, but we will spend the next two sessions on Kiyozawa, because he's so key to this modern Shin Buddhism. Then we'll spend time on Kaneko, and then I want to spend at least 2 sessions on Soga, because he, for one thing, he's very deep and he has a lot that he's presented. And hopefully we'll get into Yasuda, and as I mentioned before, because Akirasu has been a big influence here in the States, and also Shuichi Maeda, as many of you know of Maeda Center in Berkeley that Dr. Neda teaches at. And then finally, we'll have a review at the end. So this whole PowerPoint presentation will be sent out, hopefully to everyone as a, from Reverend Osa. Okay, so if you're interested in the background of some of these people, there's this book here, Cultivating Spirituality. But because it's so expensive, even the ebook is like $26, and then the paperback is like $38 or something, and then the hardback, which I bought, that's like $90. So if only if you feel comfortable, you could get that book. But the one book I hope everyone can get a hold of is this one, December Fan, published by Shinshu Center of America. You can go to that website to order it, or BCA Bookstore should have it. Most of the Higashi temples should have a supply on hand. Unfortunately, at our temple, Buddhist Temple of Chicago, I only have 1 copy left, and I think I know who's going to get it. And I think she knows too who she is. But your other Higashi temples should have a supply, and I hope everyone can get this book. It's a translation by Dr. Ned, and these are the pieces we'll be referring to at the next 2 sessions. So, so I think I covered pretty much this overview, and I see